What's causing all this? The Four Horsemen, pro wrestling's most elite stable. The Four Horsemen were the standard, the blueprint for heel factions to follow for years to come, with their concept still being utilised to this very day. Feared by their enemies at the time, yet respected today by pro wrestling fans, the Horsemen, in my opinion, should be rightfully recognised as one of the best and most important stables of all time. The thing is, it can be quite tricky for new fans or even seasoned fans to learn more about the Horsemen or find out what they were all about, because there's been so many versions of the group and so many storylines taking place within the faction's 14-year history. So today, I want to break down every iteration of the Four Horsemen. I'll also take a look at some other aspects of the group, including how they came to be, but please be aware that it's impossible to cover every big match and moment in one video because there's just way too much to look at. A Four Horsemen video series would be more ideal in order to cover everything, and I have been considering that idea for quite some time, but for now, this video will give you information on every version of the Horsemen, how guys left the group, how guys joined the group, and how the Horsemen fared in terms of adapting to new eras of pro wrestling.
If you think about it for a second, you realize that the Horsemen started right here. It started with Gene and I.
In kayfabe, Ole Anderson said the Horsemen dated all the way back to the 60s, but this wasn't true. Ole's claim was made to further a storyline where he was going to get kicked out of the group, but this is worth bringing up for those who want to get into the lore of the Horsemen. Ole claimed the first four members were himself, Gene Anderson, Arn Anderson, and Ric Flair, but the real formation of the Horsemen wouldn't happen until the mid-80s. Ric Flair had been associated with the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, a tag team that also had a few different members, but one thing was always a consistent with the crew. They all included members of the Anderson family. Gene and Lars Anderson were the original Wrecking Crew, one of the great tag teams of the mid to late 60s. Baby brother Ole would arrive on the scene in 1969, and in 1985 Ole would reform the group with his kayfabe nephew Arn Anderson. You may have thought Arn was Ole's brother, but it really depends on the territory and the era. Arn and Ole were billed as brothers, cousins, nephew and uncle, but they weren't really related. In Mid-Atlantic in the 70s, Ric Flair was billed as the cousin of Gene and Ole Anderson, and even though the cousins teamed together and fought against each other on occasion, they established a working relationship that would lead to the genesis of the Four Horsemen. Fast forward to the mid-80s, and Ole Anderson sells championship wrestling from Georgia to Jim Crockett Promotions. Crockett also buys the Saturday evening TBS time slots from Vince McMahon, so 2 hours of NWA wrestling would air on Saturdays from Ted Turner's Atlanta studios, and this is where the Four Horsemen would call home.
You're talking about the Four Horsemen of professional wrestling, the people that make things happen.
The original Four Horsemen consisted of Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, and Ole Anderson. The group came together organically. There was no meeting held behind closed doors where this faction was planned out weeks or months in advance. The men in the group had the same enemies, but the one man who the Horsemen feuded with the most in those early days was Dusty Rhodes. Tully Blanchard had helped Ole and Arn break Sam Houston's arm in August of 1985, months before the group formalised their alliance. Not to mention, Tully was already feuding with Dusty and Dusty's protege, Magnum TA. Dusty also had history with Flair and the Andersons, so through Dusty, Magnum, and other NWA babyfaces, the group that would become known as the Four Horsemen kind of intertwined and became associated through common enemies. A cage match in Atlanta kick-started the faction though. On September 29, 1985, Flair defeated Nikita Koloff in a successful title defense, and when Flair got jumped by Ivan and Nikita after the match, it was Dusty Rhodes who came to his aid. Flair warned Dusty previously to stay out of his business, but Dusty took this warning lightly, it seems, as right after helping out the Nature Boy, Dusty himself got jumped by the Andersons. Flair joined in on the attack and Dusty suffered a broken ankle. A riot almost broke out in the Omni, and this attack began the long and storied feud between Dusty and the Horsemen. Tully Blanchard, meanwhile, had enjoyed watching the Andersons and Flair destroy Dusty Rhodes, and seeing as the Andersons also had issues with Magnum TA, it made sense for Blanchard and his valet Baby Doll to align themselves with these three villains. He would begin joining the Andersons for 6-man tags, he would cut promos with Arn and Ole, and that's how the original four came together. It was all because they shared the same adversaries. The November 9th, 1985 episode of World Championship Wrestling on TBS has been credited as the night where Arn first called the group the Four Horsemen. However, Arn has since confirmed that he called the group the Horsemen on promos taped for local markets before this promo. These local promos are hard to come by, of course, so pinpointing the exact promo where Arn first said the Four Horsemen has been difficult. Wrestlers cut multiple promos in a single recording session, so every region or market would have their own specific tape. But Arn has said that the name Four Horsemen was said completely off the cuff, and it was Tony Schiavone who told Arn that he just named the faction without even knowing it. Again, it's another example of these early days of the Horsemen being very organic.
Now things are really starting to change. It's going to be a whole new ballgame.
So the first iteration of the Horsemen featured Flair, Ole Anderson, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, and Baby Doll as Tully's valet. It's easy to forget that Baby Doll was associated with the group before JJ Dillon. Dillon became associated with Tully Blanchard when Tully accused Baby Doll of being unfaithful. However, it was all a setup by Dillon so he could get himself aligned with Blanchard. Dillon's plan worked perfectly. He said goodbye to his previous client, Buddy Landell, and Dillon became the administrative director of Tully Blanchard Enterprises while Baby Doll aligned herself with Dusty Rhodes. Dillon would then get promoted as the executive director of the Four Horsemen. Some fans see this version of the Horsemen as the true version of the Horsemen. For some, no other iteration was as good as the original lineup, and it's not because it features the four best wrestlers, but because of the overall impact the faction had.
And because of that reason, there's an elite group, and this elite group is named the Horsemen. And that's what I'm going to be. Thank you.
The moment Lex Luger debuted in Jim Crockett Promotions, he announced he wanted to be a member of the Four Horsemen. Tully Blanchard took notice of Luger wanting to join up, but JJ Dillon said there were only 4 spots available and all 4 were taken up. That didn't stop JJ whispering something in Luger's ear though that left many fans guessing what was going to happen next. At the same time, Ole Anderson was having some issues with the group. Not only had Arn talked bad about Ole on commentary and how Arn was embarrassed that he didn't currently hold a championship, but Ole also missed some TV dates due to taking care of his son and other family matters. Luger would become an associate member of the Horsemen, and it was around about this time that Ole cut that promo about the Horsemen's roots going all the way back to the late 60s with the Wrecking Crew. Still though, things began boiling over when Tully told Ole that he should be spending more time dealing with Horseman business and not spending time with his snot-nosed kid. Ole ends up decking Blanchard, JJ Dillon asks for an apology and he gets decked too a little later on. Tully then jumps Ole, and this all leads to a spot opening up for associate member Lex Luger. Lex joins on the 14th of March episode of World Championship Wrestling on TBS. Later that year, the Horsemen would compete in the first ever War Games match. They lost unfortunately, and JJ Dillon also got himself a separated shoulder in the legendary bout, and the Horsemen would get themselves another associate member, Dark Journey. Dark Journey would serve as Tully's executive secretary, a fancy name for a valet I guess, but she was released in July of 1987, meaning she only stayed associated with the Horsemen for around 2 months.
You know, everybody thinks that what I've done is so bad. All I have done is join the most elite group of professional wrestling.
Dusty Rhodes defeated Lex Luger at Starrcade 87 for the US title. Ric Flair defeated Ronnie Garvin for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship at the pay-per-view, and Tully and Arn retained the NWA tag titles in a match against the Road Warriors. Double A expressed his disappointment that not everyone in the Four Horsemen left Starrcade holding a championship, and Luger didn't like the fact that Anderson made this passive-aggressive comment. Lex would blame this on JJ Dillon interfering, and he demanded that JJ stayed out of his matches so Lex could either win or lose on his own accord. But, as we all know, doing things yourself isn't the Horseman way. Lex, Arn, Tully, and JJ Dillon all competed in the Miami Bunkhouse Stampede in early December, and these Horsemen guys ended up the last competitors in the match. Dillon wanted to win the Bunkhouse Stampede, so he had this one last achievement in his career, and while Tully and Arn agreed to eliminate themselves, Lex Luger did not. Luger threw Dillon over the top rope to win the Bunkhouse Stampede and officially end his Four Horsemen membership. The others jumped Lex after the match, and Luger took a classic Horseman beating to solidify his departure. Ric Flair would then announce that Barry Windham was going to take Lex's place, but Windham didn't seem too keen at first. He and Luger would form a popular tag team that went up against the villains of JCP, but their friendship only lasted a few months. In a match that aired on the 23rd of April 1988 episode of World Championship Wrestling, Windham turned his back on Lex to join the Four Horsemen, and he pretty much handed the tag team titles to Tully and Arn. While I mentioned earlier that many fans say the original Horsemen were always the best, this version here with Barry Windham is seen by many as the best in-ring version of the group, the best Four Horsemen iteration when it came to actual wrestling matches. Windham was a great choice for the Four Horsemen, and while the faction helped Lex Luger in terms of a big push from the get-go, Barry helped to establish the Four Horsemen as a faction for elite superstars.
When we told you we came here, we were hired to do a job. It was win matches and bring that gold home to Bobby Heenan's family.
Tully and Arn were defeated by the Midnight Express in September of 1988, and they departed for the WWF, meaning the Four Horsemen were no more. The two felt they were underpaid, with Tully saying he got $1,000 for his appearance at the Great American Bash 88 as one half of the tag team champions, whereas JJ Dillon was paid $3,000. Crockett was in the middle of selling the promotion to Ted Turner. Turner executives wanted to interview various personnel in regards to working for Crockett and what the experience has been like so far, and Tully Blanchard was one of the men who got interviewed. Of course, Tully was still feeling bitter, so he badmouthed Crockett upper management during the interview. Word got back to Jim Crockett Jr., and shortly afterwards, both Arn and Tully said they wanted to leave. So the two left to join WWF. They became known as the Brainbusters, and they were managed by the great Bobby Heenan. What's noteworthy here though is that Tully Blanchard would never wrestle as a Horseman again following his departure. He failed a drug test when trying to get back into the company now known as WCW, and his offer was removed from the table. WCW tried to get Tully in a few times for Horseman reunions, but he always felt offended by what he thought were lowball offers, and so one of the cornerstones of the Horsemen was completely done with the faction. While Arn and Tully were away, Windham and Flair continued to get managed by JJ Dillon. They were just known as the Horsemen and not the Four Horsemen, and fans got excited when they teased that the Road Warriors might become members of the faction, but that didn't happen.
Electrified! Yes! 10,000 people! Yes! Nationwide! Yes! Tonight! Woo!
Kendall Windham became a Horseman very, very briefly. 1 week he held up the symbol of excellence, and the next week he's gone after the Horsemen bring in Hiro Matsuda as their new manager. JJ Dillon had left WCW and Matsuda was his replacement. However, Matsuda bought the Horseman contracts and the faction would be left dormant. Flair and the Windhams would become part of Matsuda's Yamazaki Corporation, so officially at this time in February 1989, the Four Horsemen are no more. Dillon meanwhile goes to work for Vince McMahon, and Barry Windham also eventually leaves to join WWF. People see that first era of the Four Horsemen as the true showcase for the faction, and things would never be the same again. And along with this, WCW would never be the same either, as the focus on their product shifted in terms of content and overall presentation. Still, let's carry on. Ole Anderson came back to WCW in October 1989 to back up Sting and Ric Flair. These two were going up against the Great Muta and Terry Funk at Halloween Havoc 89, and yes, Ric Flair was a babyface. In December that year, Arn Anderson also returned and the Horsemen reunited, though Tully Blanchard couldn't return for reasons already mentioned. Days after AA returns, the Horsemen add Sting to the group after the Stinger defeated Flair in the Iron Man tournament at Starrcade 89, a victory that would lead to Sting getting a shot at Flair's world title at Wrestle War 90. In January the following year, woman, real name Nancy Sullivan, revealed that she wanted to be Ric Flair's valet. Flair loved the attention, and even after initially turning down the offer, Slick Rick decided to bring woman in and she became associated with the faction. The Horsemen then gave Sting an ultimatum at the 10th Clash of the Champions show. He either backs out of this title match at Wrestle War against Flair, or the Horsemen are gonna put him out of wrestling for good. Sting says he won't give up his title shot, so the Horsemen attack him, and this means the group is once again turned heel. It also means there's now only 3 members. It goes without saying though, the Horsemen were always better as heels anyway. Turns out that Sting wouldn't get his title shot in the end, at least immediately. Later on at the Clash, he got legitimately injured when trying to climb a cage to get at Flair. So Lex Luger would take Sting's spot at Wrestle War. Arn Anderson would end up getting injured at the Wrestle War pay-per-view, a neck injury that would end up taking him completely out of the game years later, but we'll get to that soon. Barry Windham made his WCW return 2 months after Sting got kicked out, so Ric Flair, Ole Anderson, Arn Anderson and Windham made up the reunited Horsemen from April 1990 to May 1990. Ole Anderson would retire from in-ring action and become the manager of the group, so a spot became available for a brand new Horseman.
Only care about one person, and that's me, and that belt around my waist.
On the 11th of May 1990 episode of WCW Power Hour, during a Jim Cornette's Louisville Slugger segment, a new member of the Four Horsemen got revealed, Big Sid Vicious. Sid was a very unique horseman for sure. He was big, he was tough, he was merciless in the ring, but whether he was a good fit for the Four Horsemen faction is a topic that's very much up for debate. While it makes sense for the faction to add some muscle to the group and get themselves one of the biggest, meanest guys they could find, Sid didn't exactly carry himself like other members of the group. And while you may be thinking that such a statement is absolutely ridiculous, the Horsemen did always feature men and women who presented themselves in a certain way. You had to walk the walk, talk the talk, have a certain in-ring pedigree, and always remember that the group comes first. In the WWE's Four Horsemen documentary, everyone interviewed speaks badly about Sid being a member of the group. Arn Anderson said that Sid was more focused on what the Horsemen could do for him rather than what he could do to help the Horsemen. Barry Windham called Sid inept at wrestling, and Ric Flair said Sid wasn't a good fit for the group. He shouldn't have been there. His attitude was wrong, and it was, and I quote, embarrassing. Sid would achieve some great things in pro wrestling, and no one can ever say the big man had a bad career at all. But I'm also in the camp that didn't really enjoy Sid as a member of the Four Horsemen. Shortly after Sid arrived, Woman left the group, though she would end up getting associated with the faction again in a few years' time.
We're gonna rock and roll because the Horsemen, woo, are reunited again.
1991 saw the Horsemen dissolve once again due to core members leaving for the WWF. Sid's contract expired, so he travelled to New York, but the biggest shocker came when Ric Flair also packed his bags to head over to WWF. Along with his expensive suits and expensive robes, Flair also packed the big gold belt, and on WWF TV, he was briefly recognised as the real world's champion. Arn Anderson, meanwhile, would form a tag team with Larry Zbyszko back in Atlanta known as the Enforcers, and Barry Windham would also get pushed as a babyface. When Ric Flair came back to WCW in 1993, the company teased a Flair vs Windham showdown for the NWA Heavyweight title that Windham won at Super Brawl 2, the show where Ric Flair made his return. But Flair had a no-compete clause in his WWF contract, so the match was put on hold. In the meantime, Flair began hosting a Flair for the Gold, his own talk show that would get put in place in lieu of Flair actually wrestling matches. So at Slamboree 1993, a Horseman reunion was promoted by WCW, and fans who purchased the pay-per-view would get to see wrestling's most elite faction get together one more time. The original plan was for Flair, Arn, Ole and Tully to reunite on a Flair for the Gold, but WCW couldn't reach an agreement with Tully Blanchard. They would cook up a half-assed explanation for Tully's absence. They said Barry Windham took him out before the show. So here comes the latest member of the Four Horsemen instead, Tully Blanchard's replacement, Paul Roma. The reaction to Roma walking out was pretty bad. WCW had promoted this thing as a reunion, not another incarnation. Roma wasn't exactly a high-caliber superstar either in terms of his place on the card, so fans were left confused when this mid-card guy, who fans primarily knew from WWF, was given membership into the prestigious Horseman Club. Ole Anderson was gone after Slamboree, the faction moved on as a three-piece, and there really is nothing to say about this iteration. Roma said Flair gave him a hard time while he was in the group. Paul would mainly tag with AA during his tenure, and this version of the Horsemen is considered by many to be the very worst. Later in the year, after Paul Roma left the group after turning on AA, Arn Anderson got himself in a legit fight over in England with Big Sid Vicious that ended with both men getting seriously wounded. So Anderson had to take time off and the Horsemen again just kinda fizzles out. 1993 was not a good year for fans of the Four Horsemen.
Ric Flair has always been and always will be the flagship of the Horsemen. We're going to respect, honor, and protect that at all costs. That's our main focus of business.
Shortly before the debut of WCW Monday Nitro, the Horsemen were back on TV screens and ready to destroy anyone in their path once again. WCW was a completely different place during this era. The Horsemen had already had their days in Crockett Promotions, their days in early WCW, but now it was time for the Horsemen to try and entertain a new breed of fans in a promotion where Hulk Hogan reigned supreme. Flair and Arn Anderson got themselves into a rivalry, and a match between the two took place at Fall Brawl 1995. Anderson got a little help from friend Brian Pillman, and these two, Pillman and Anderson, would announce themselves as the New Horsemen. Their mission was simple. They wanted to put Ric Flair out of wrestling for good. Turns out though, it was all a big swerve. Sting joined forces with Ric Flair to battle Pillman and Anderson at Halloween Havoc, but Flair turned his back on the Stinger and he sided with the New Horsemen. 1 month later, the reformation of the Four Horsemen gets completed when Chris Benoit joins the group. Adding Pillman and Benoit into the faction I thought was a good move. You could argue that Pillman didn't fit the mold too well, but rather than ignore Pillman's shortcomings as a horseman, the faction decided to play up to them instead. The loose cannon gimmick was born out of Brand's time as a horseman because the Enforcer had some difficulties keeping him under control. What's more, according to Chris Jericho on his Talk is Jericho podcast, Brian Pillman was originally going to create his own version of the Four Horsemen that would eventually feud with the originals. Brian called himself the Rogue Horseman during this time, but a faction of Rogue Horsemen featuring Pillman, Jericho, Benoit, and another unnamed superstar could have been excellent, but it didn't happen. Brian ended up jumping to ECW, he then joined WWF, and he would never return to WCW, even though rumour has it he always planned on coming back once his stock went up in New York. When Pillman left, an unlikely new pro wrestler took his place, Steve Mongo McMichael of the Chicago Bears. And again, we have another member of the faction who fans point out is one of the worst, but there's also something pretty endearing about Big Mongo that's hard to explain. He wasn't good in the ring, far from it, but boy did he ever try. Through McMichael joining the group, Flair feuding with Randy Savage and Benoit feuding with Kevin Sullivan, the group also got themselves new valets. Woman returned to the group through Chris Benoit, McMichael's wife Deborah became associated with the faction, and Miss Elizabeth joined up after turning her back on Macho Man Randy Savage. The NWO then appeared in WCW, and just like that, the Four Horsemen were no longer the top heel faction anymore. The New World Order brought a lot of intrigue and a lot of reality to Monday Night Wrestling shows, and as historic as the Four Horsemen were, they simply struggled to compete against the attention and controversy that NWO brought to the table. Jeff Jarrett became a member briefly, and he got involved in a feud with fellow horseman Steve McMichael. This would lead to Double J's time in the faction being pretty limited, and it also leads to fans not really considering Mr. Jarrett as a fully fledged member of the group. But if we count Kendall Windham, then we have to also include Double J. This iteration of the Horsemen ended when Arn Anderson announced his retirement from pro wrestling. Double A wanted Kurt Hennig to take his spot as the Enforcer. Hennig agreed, but then in the Fall Brawl 97 War Games match, Hennig shocked the Horsemen by slamming the cage door on Ric Flair's head. Hennig joined the New World Order, and again the Four Horsemen looked second rate. No way in hell someone would have gotten away with this kind of treachery back in the 80s. But in the mid-90s, Flair decided to disband the Horsemen because he felt he was bringing Benoit and McMichael down with him. Flair wanted his teammates to find success on their own, so once again the Horsemen had disbanded.
Somebody told me that the Horsemen were having a party tonight in Greenville.
In mid-1998, Chris Benoit and Steve McMichael began teasing a Horseman reunion on Monday Nitro. There was one big problem though. Ric Flair had been fired from WCW after attending his son's high school wrestling match instead of attending a WCW event he was booked for. Benoit started teaming up with Dean Malenko, and these two would ask Arn Anderson for guidance. They wanted Arn to once again bring back the Horsemen to bring the fight to the NWO Black and White and NWO Wolfpack, but Arn didn't want to do it. He said he had the heart, but he didn't have the tools anymore. So he told these two rather aggressively that the Horsemen will not be getting back together. JJ Dillon, now an on-screen authority figure, would also ask Arn Anderson to bring the group back, but Anderson walked away. Arn would end up saving Dean Malenko though when the NWO were about to slam a cage door on his head just like they'd done to Flair at Fall Brawl 97, and after witnessing this, Arn decides to bring back wrestling's most elite faction. Flair settles his legal matters with WCW behind the scenes, and on the 14th of September 1998 edition of Monday Nitro, the Horsemen are officially reformed once again in what's probably my personal favourite Nitro promo of all time. Arn gives credit to the men in the ring. He tells fans to be careful what they wish for. He stops and he says, "I almost forgot the Fourth Horseman," as he invites Slick Rick to come down to the ring. Flair's entrance is something else here. The South Carolina audience lose their minds as the Nature Boy walks that aisle once again, and Flair cuts an emotional promo about the Horseman being alive and well and about how Eric Bischoff tried to take him out of the game. So now the Horseman consists of Flair, Steve McMichael, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko and Arn Anderson as their manager. A few months later, Barry Windham returns to WCW and fans think he's going to be a Horseman once again, as does Ric Flair. But Barry ends up siding with Eric Bischoff in the NWO, although he wouldn't become a fully fledged member. He was more like a pet henchman.
What did you tell us? Wait till Flair gets stroke, wait till Flair gets stroke, wait till Flair gets stroke. Flair's got stroke, Flair is for Flair.
The Four Horsemen were met with many of the same problems they suffered during the early days of Monday Nitro, only this time it could be considered even worse. WCW was getting progressively more messy as we head into 1999. Focus remains on the NWO, even though that faction has become a mess in its own right. And WCW as a company are struggling to maintain comprehensive, meaningful storylines that play out with a true beginning, middle and end. The Horsemen have their own issues too. McMichael gets released from the company after suffering a foot injury in February 99. Ric Flair has become the storyline president of WCW, who seems more concerned about his son and less concerned with Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit. Arn Anderson stuck in the middle, trying to hold things together. It's just not good, and it continues to be like this until the group eventually part ways. On the 24th of May episode of WCW Nitro, Benoit and Malenko felt betrayed when Ric Flair awarded DDP and Bam Bam Bigelow of the Jersey Triad title shots while leaving his teammates out in the cold. Double A tried to smooth things over, but again, Flair was too busy trying to push his son to listen to what Anderson had to say. Later in the night, Roddy Piper challenged Flair, DDP and Bigelow to a 6-man tag. Piper would have 2 mystery partners, and you guessed it, Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit sided with Roddy Piper. So on this very night, the Horsemen finally died and the faction would never make a return. Arn Anderson stuck by Ric Flair through it all, but the Four Horsemen were finished. And that was the Four Horsemen, every iteration and every member. As mentioned, the Horsemen were the blueprint for others to follow. Jim Ross has said multiple times that DX and the NWO wouldn't have existed the way they did if it wasn't for the Horsemen. The Dangerous Alliance had ties with the Horsemen, being a villainous heel stable in WCW that also included Arn Anderson. You've got Evolution, that Triple H said was 100% inspired by the Four Horsemen, and a group that also helped Nature Boy Ric Flair remember just who he was when dealing with personal issues. You take the likes of NWO, DX, the Dangerous Alliance and Evolution, and look at the factions they inspired. It all traces back to 1985 when Arn Anderson formally introduced wrestling fans to the Four Horsemen. Let me know your favourite version of the Four Horsemen in the comments, and tell me your favourite matches and moments that included the Horsemen. I hope you enjoyed this one, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.